An
empire that treats its vassals this way only shows how deep in the shit it is itself. The campaign against Russia was really the German economy's biggest payoff plan. There has been a reversal of perpetrator and victim, and it is passed on from one generation to the next. Is Russophobia a form of racism?
Phobie eine Form des Rassismus? Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Against the Current, in person. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep quiet about. Can a lost war be won? We mean the war against Russia, which was not a war like any other. What role did intellectuals, or what remains of them, academics, play in preparing for the war? And what significance did economic elites have? The author of this book raised these questions back in 1977. Reparations, or How to Win a Lost War. It was written by the author and university lecturer Michael Schneider. Hello. Can a lost war be won?
Hallo. Kann ein verlorener Krieg gewonnen werden?
Kann es im wirtschaftlichen Sinne. Und das hat die Bundesrepublik.
It can do so in economic terms. The Federal Republic demonstrated that in the 1950s, after the collapse of the Third Reich. With the help of the Americans, as we know, they succeeded in restoring the old economic elite of the Third Reich. The big bankers and factory owners who drove rearmament, made enormous amounts of money from it, and later also from employing forced laborers. You can see that in the fact that share capital grew enormously between 1942 and 1944, or 1945. German share capital boomed. Kurt Pritzkolite, one of the post-war era's economically critical business journalists, documented that.
Einer der wirtschaftskritischen Wirtschaftsjournalisten der Nachkriegszeit, der hat das nachgewiesen. Ich habe den oft hier in dem Buch zitiert.
I quoted him often in the book. Above all, the campaign against Russia played a major role for the German economy. Mr. Hermann Abs, the head of Deutsche Bank at the time, had all these plans for how to bring the raw materials, the conquered resources, Russia's raw materials, back into the German Reich and how to exploit them. Abs and other gentlemen from big business gave a great deal of thought to this. There were plans and there were precise calculations. So the campaign against Russia was really the German economy's biggest amortization plan.
That means the goal was to obtain new collateral for loans.
Because they were heavily in debt. We know that at the time, the Americans, especially American banks, helped Germany, which was still struggling with the global economic crisis, get back on its feet through the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. All those loans had to be repaid. And in that respect, if we set ideology aside for a moment, the German Wehrmacht's campaign against Russia was not only the worst, most brutal, race-based war of extermination of the modern era. At the same time, it was the German economy's largest repayment plan.
Im englischen Idiom gibt
There's a saying in English, all wars are bankers' wars. All wars are the wars of bank managers. Is that true?
Der Bankmanager, stimmt das?
There's a lot to that in any case. Right now, I'm really enjoying reading the posts by Alex Craner. He's an American geopolitical analyst who deals specifically with this issue. He's produced very precise analyses, as he did during the COVID crisis, but now especially regarding the war in Ukraine, of the role banks play and how they, so to speak, how they fuel these wars through loans and other measures. It's an ugly, terrible issue. By the way, there is now also a very good analysis by Krieger and Wolfram Elsner on the role of finance capital. For a long time, the left failed to recognize that finance capital has now taken on an extremely important role, that finance capital has, so to speak, largely subordinated industrial capital to itself and can therefore set the course for wars.
Can you explain how financial capital drives wars?
Well, in general, it's now the case that the big bankers have in some instances become heads of government themselves. Just look at our head of government, Friedrich Merz, who, as is well known, was the head of BlackRock Germany, a BlackRock man. Macron, too, was at Rothschild. He comes from Rothschild. Draghi, who was president of the European Central Bank for a long time, comes from Goldman Sachs. The same goes for Sunak, who was British Prime Minister for a while. So these big bankers have now actually managed to become heads of government as well, and that naturally allows them to accomplish an incredible amount in the interests of their own profession. But it all happens very discreetly.
Das findet allerdings sehr diskret statt. Insofern macht es auch wenig Aufruhr unter den Menschen.
So it attracts very little attention from people. It happens very discreetly, but it does happen. And to anyone interested in it, I can only recommend this. There is now a publication by Elsner and Krieger in which they have really worked through and described the role of finance capital, a role that was overlooked or underestimated for a long time in the classical left-wing literature. Elsner had already done this in his book about China, and now the two of them have done one together with Papi Rosa Verlag. But of course, those are small print runs, so they do not reach a large audience.
Aber das sind natürlich kleine Auflagen und erreichen kein großes Publikum. Das ist das Problem.
Im Jahr 2013
That is the problem. In 2013, the current NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, was Prime Minister of the Netherlands. In that capacity, he concluded an agreement with Shell and the Ukrainian government to explore energy reserves in eastern Ukraine. It was unfortunate that these areas are now occupied by Russia. Is that a cause of the war?
Liegt darin eine Kriegsursache?
Aber bestimmt, es haben ja zum Beispiel die beiden.
Absolutely. For example, the two American Republican lawmakers, Graham and what's the other one's name? Graham and another one, openly admitted it. They said the raw materials in Donbass are estimated at many, many, many hundreds of billions. They don't want to leave those to Putin. They want to exploit them themselves.
Die möchte man nicht gern dem Putin überlassen. Die möchte man selber gerne ausschöpfen.
Und 80%
And 80% of Ukraine's gross national product was generated in the Donbass before the coup on the Maidan.
im Donbass erwirtschaftet.
80%. Ah ja, das wusste ich nicht. 80%, das ist interessant.
80%. Oh yes, I didn't know that. 80%. That's interesting. Yes, yes, yes. No, I mean, that's completely clear. And the latest deal that went through Trump and Putin sat down together. And in the latest deal over Ukraine's future, it was no coincidence that the head of BlackRock, what's his name? Larry Fink, got involved. And he has, so to speak, already been positioned as the head, organizer, and investor for the post-war period. So that's no coincidence. And generally, as we know, big American capital is already very heavily involved in Ukraine. BlackRock has already bought in as well. Then a large part of American agribusiness has already bought into Ukraine. They're deeply involved in the famous, highly productive black soil, the Ukrainian black soil.
Ukrainische Schwarzerde, da sind sie ganz dick drin. Und in anderen Bereichen auch. Also die USA wird sich.
And in other areas as well. On the one hand, the US wants to leave Europe with the downstream costs of this war. But at the same time, it wants to recover what it invested itself, because it has in effect made big business out of this. Their analyses have described how most of the so-called capital injections Washington gave to Ukraine initially went to the American arms industry. And in this way, American capital is already well on its way to recouping its costs for the war in Ukraine. Above all, they will do that through this new raw materials deal that is now being negotiated, which they already have under control. And if you look at it closely, it can only make you sick.
Dann kann's einem eigentlich nur schlecht werden, ne?
Schon vor längerer Zeit haben die Finanzinvestoren
Some time ago, the financial investors BlackRock and JP Morgan formed a joint consortium to manage Ukraine's government debt.
zu managen.
Can you make money from debt?
Schulden verdienen.
Yes, apparently you can.
Ja, offenbar kann man das, ja. Das, ja, sicher.
Yes, certainly. I mean, practically every debtor fears that moment of truth when the creditors come and call in the debts. To avoid that moment, more and more new debt is taken on to pay the interest on the old debt. That is the mechanism the financial world operates on today, and it is what has made America the largest debtor in the history of the world. America is basically already a bankrupt state. By the way, some geopolitical analysts said recently that the United States is actually a bankrupt state.
Dass die USA eigentlich ein bankrotter Staat ist. Und das ist auch der Grund, warum sie ständig Kriege führen müssen, diese.
And that is also the reason why they constantly have to wage wars in order to deal with these debts. And above all, there is the fact that this financial market has been completely inflated by structured securities, derivatives of every kind, warrants. Exactly. And those are really bubbles. They are financial bubbles. And if these financial bubbles are not eventually backed again by real assets, for example, raw materials from the Donbass or from somewhere else, then this financial capitalism basically has no basis for existence. At some point, it collapses. And that is the deeper reason for these wars.
With every debt restructuring, creditors need new collateral, and if necessary, that collateral has to be brought into the flow of capital, even through campaigns of conquest. Very good. I've never heard it put that clearly.
I would put it that clearly as well. Yes, they have to be factored into campaigns of conquest.
And in Hitler's and the U.S. campaigns of conquest, millions of people lost their lives. How many Soviet citizens had to give their lives?
So historians now estimate a relatively reliable figure of 24 million Soviet citizens. But here's the big illusion, one that most people accept as well. Most people think they died in regular acts of war. That isn't true. 8 to 10 million soldiers died outside of regular combat operations. Just think about that. 8 to 10 million. Either they starved to death. More than 1 million people starved during the siege of Leningrad, or they died in German prisoner of war camps. 3.3 million Russians died, either through forced labor in underground facilities, Dora, for example, or they starved to death, or they were shot or abused in the concentration camps. 3.3 million. And I find it outrageous that in Germany there are no monuments, no memorial sites for this. We have an enormous culture of remembrance around the Holocaust. Rightly so, because it was a crime against humanity. But there is another crime against humanity that claimed even more victims than the Holocaust, namely the campaign against Russia. And all across Germany, my Soviet friend was dismayed by this when we were working on this project, which I can tell you more about in a moment. When we traveled together through Germany, through the Federal Republic of Germany. And he said, listen, I see Holocaust memorials everywhere, and so on, and places of remembrance. There are also many cultural events here in Germany. But where are the events and memorials that remember the enormous sacrifices my people had to make in this war? And he was completely shaken. He also looked for people from the German wartime generation with whom he could talk about the massacres. He found only very few.
An author for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Stefan Locke, wrote an entire page 3 piece about commemorating the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. But on that entire page, Stefan Locke does not mention a single time that the Red Army liberated Auschwitz. What do you make of that? It's outrageous.
Ja. Was halten Sie davon? Das ist ungeheuerlich. Es ist ungeheuerlich. Also die Ignoranz oder das Verdrängen.
It is outrageous. The ignorance, the suppression, and the silence surrounding these enormous crimes committed by the Germans during the campaign against Russia remain taboo to this day. For myself, I've summed it up this way, in my book back then, and now again in the major new essay on the war in Ukraine that I'm currently working on. The exception was the generation of '68. They confronted it. But since 1945, and with the baby boomer generation, let's say, there has been a real reversal of perpetrator and victim.
Hat eine richtige Täter-Opfer-Umkehr stattgefunden. Die Opfer, die Russen, die
The
Sowjetbürger
victims,
wurden zu
the Russians,
Tätern
the Soviet citizens, were labeled perpetrators. And after 1945, they were once again seen as the perpetrators, now also in the role of the victors and the feared judges. But there has been a reversal of perpetrator and victim, and it is passed down from one generation to the next. You can see that. Otherwise, there would be no way to explain how this incredible Russophobia emerged here in Germany within just a few years, unless there were a line of tradition and, so to speak, an almost genetic inheritance of this reversal of perpetrator and victim. I experienced that myself as a child.
Ich habe das als Kind ja auch schon erlebt. Ich habe als Kind, als ich 5 Jahre war,
When I was a child, when I was 5, my family ended up in the upper Bavarian village of Greinau, at the foot of the Zugspitze. When I was 4 or 5, I heard horror stories about the Russians that made the grim fairy tales seem mild by comparison. Stories that Russians had nailed German women and farmers to barn doors, and so on and so forth. That means I grew up with this hatred of Russia, this Russophobic hatred. It wasn't until the era of '68, when I began to look more deeply into the whole history, that I saw what an incredible propagandistic demonization it had been.
propagandistische Verteufelung war. Nicht nur der Russen, sondern das war eine propagandistische...
Not just against the Russians, but that was a propaganda structure throughout the entire Adenauer era. The Russians were once again the bad guys. They were once again the enemies in the Cold War. And now they are again. As if there had never been a Willy Brandt, no Willy Brandt taking a knee in Moscow, in Warsaw, and so on. It is outrageous how this works, and it is deeply troubling. I am deeply troubled that at my age, I have had to witness Germany once again being pushed, so to speak, by the media and politics onto this Russophobic path. And unfortunately, there is very little resistance to it.
Und es leider sehr wenig Widerstand dagegen gibt. Das ist überhaupt das Bedrückendste.
That is the most disturbing part of all. Is Russophobia a form of racism? Yes, absolutely. What do you attribute this reversal of guilt to? Is it just propaganda?
Ist das nur Propaganda?
Nee, es ist nicht nur Propaganda. Es ist natürlich, also wenn man weiß, was unsere Väter und Großväter im Russlandfeldzug für Verbrechen begangen haben, die meisten wissen das ja gar nicht. Es wissen noch nicht mal meine Enkel. Wenn ich denen davon erzähle, die denken, ich erzähle Schauermärchen, ne? Weil diese Verbrechen so ungeheuerlich sind, waren natürlich die...
Because these crimes were so horrific, the German soldiers returning home from captivity and from the campaign came back to Germany traumatized in their own way as well. But they were traumatized, so to speak, by having taken part in the greatest crime of modern times. War crimes, really. They couldn't process that themselves, I think, most of them. They suppressed it, they glossed it over, or they had nightmares about it. I know, for example, that my uncle, who took part in the campaign in Russia, had nightmares about it until the end of his life.
Bis an sein Lebensende hat Albträume gehabt, ne?
Wie wirkt das denn?
How does that affect the generations that come after? You said your grandchildren think grandpa just slept badly or something.
Die Enkel, naja gut, ich will es mit denen ja nicht verderben, weil...
The grandchildren. Well, I don't want to fall out with them, because of course I want to maintain a good relationship with the family somehow. But we just avoid the subject. It's very difficult. They say, well, it was a long time ago. Sure, the Germans committed a terrible injustice, but that was 80 years ago now, and so on. For them, they don't see the continuity. The continuity, even though it's obvious.
Die Kontinuitäten, obwohl die auf der Hand liegen.
Wenn die frühere Außenministerin
When the former foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, said something along these lines during her time in office in Frankfurt and der Oder, I'm standing here on the shoulders of my grandfather, who also fought against the Russians.
gegen die Russen gekämpft hat. Wie erklären Sie sich das?
Das erkläre ich mir nur aus dieser...
How do I explain that? I can only explain it through this reversal of victim and perpetrator. And that has become an almost genetic trait, or at least an absolutely essential characteristic, of this post-war Adenauer society. And it continues to be passed on because it is not really worked through. I saw that in my 2 books on Russia. They were important, but they actually had only small print runs. They never went beyond their first editions, because that's just how it is. I once spoke with Wolfram Wette. I also had a lot of... He was a historian at the Military History Research Office in Freiburg.
In Freiburg.
That was an important reference point for me when I wrote my Barbarossa book, because they had all the analyses and really did excellent work. And he once told me, you know, Michael, almost 10% of my staff, or a great many of them, quit after 1 or 2 years because they can't cope psychologically with what the documents reveal. The cruelty. The cruelty. And I can understand that. I can understand all of those people. It's unbearable.
Diese Schuldumkehr
This reversal of guilt may have led to a striking harmony of hearts after Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. At last, people could hate the Russians again. Is that true?
Konnte man wieder die Russen hassen. Stimmt das?
Ja, das war sicher eine Art Entlastung.
Yes, that was certainly a kind of relief, a collective relief. The Russians had proven to be the aggressors, although in reality, you can see it very differently. I still consider Putin's invasion a mistake because it turns all of NATO against him. But of course, one can understand it, because after all, the 2 breakaway provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk had been under constant artillery fire from the Kiev army ever since the Maidan coup of 2014.
Seitens der Kiewer Armee. Die haben ja Russland gebeten, dass sie aufgenommen werden können.
They asked Russia to admit them as threatened, but breakaway provinces of Ukraine, and they were then formally admitted. So in a sense, Russia actually had a duty to protect these 2 provinces that had become Russian. To that extent, because people always say, yes, it was a war of aggression. At first glance, it is a war of aggression. But there is this apt phrase from Machiavelli, I believe, who says, the real cause and perpetrator is not the one who takes up arms first, but the one who compels him to do so.
Derjenige, der dazu nötigt.
Yes.
I put that at the beginning of my essay on Russia.
Really, it should be the job of intellectuals, regardless of their profession, to point out these historical connections. But it isn't happening. Why not?
Ja, das ist eine Frage, die mich auch seit langem beschäftigt.
Yes, that's a question that has concerned me for a long time as well. I've repeatedly pointed to this betrayal by intellectuals, including many left-wing intellectuals, in my essays. I've lamented it and really attacked it, and I've made myself unpopular with some people because of it. But you find yourself pretty much alone in that. My friend Stefan Reinhardt has written an excellent piece called The Betrayal of the Intellectuals, in which he lays it out precisely for the individual groups of intellectuals in Germany. And it's truly shocking. It's shocking to see how intellectuals who were once committed to the left suddenly drift into these currents.
Plötzlich in diese Fahrwasser geraten. Aber natürlich hängt da immer Karrieren dran.
But of course, careers are always at stake. I mean, we've all had that experience. I'm sure you have too. If you don't write the way the mainstream does and you voice your criticism, you're very quickly out of the picture. That's how it is in Germany now. Luckily, I was independent. I had an income because I held this professorship at the Film Academy, so I wasn't dependent on writing alone. But of course, I also noticed it with many editorial offices and publications I used to write for. Suddenly, the wind was blowing in a different direction, and all of a sudden, you were out.
Wieder ein anderer Wind wehte und man plötzlich raus war. Ich bin auch aus meinem Verlag raus. Ich bin seit 19...
I'm out of my publishing house, too. I'd been with Kiepenheuer and Witch since 1980, and I had a good standing there. They published many of my books, literary works, as well as, for example, documentaries, but also many essays and academic books. Then a new boss came in. I don't want to name names, the editor-in-chief. And suddenly, to them, I was old left-wing iron. They rejected my latest novel manuscript because it also deals with East Germany and somewhat with the transition in East Germany, which I view very critically as well. I'm out of the publishing house. Basically, I no longer have a publisher.
Ich bin raus aus dem Verlag. Ich habe im Grunde keinen Verlag mehr.
Will ideological institutions like publishing houses, universities, schools, and churches be purged?
Ich denke schon. Also ich meine, das geht.
I think so. I mean, of course, it also happens through self-censorship. Many people who can sense which way the wind is blowing already know what they're still allowed to say and what they're not. And then it's clear that a university assistant, rather than risk teaching a course on Marx's Capital or other sensitive topics, would prefer to offer a seminar on Luhmann or on a postmodern philosopher like Lyotard, or something like that. So I believe it happens very much through self-censorship as well. That's been my experience.
Es läuft, glaube ich, sehr stark auch über Selbstzensur, ist meine Erfahrung.
Bertolt
Brecht writes in his play Turandot, or The Congress of the Whitewashers, "Your thoughts stink like rotten fish." That's very fitting. It's because they're traded like goods at a fish market.
Because they're traded like they are at a fish market. Very nice. Yes, very nice.
Would you agree with that?
Ja, absolut.
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Turandot or the Congress of Whitewashers.
What do the intellectuals say?
Also, ich würde sagen, jetzt ist es besonders.
Well, I would say it's especially pronounced now. It was already clear during the COVID crisis. Most intellectuals bought into this, as I would put it, very professionally orchestrated and manufactured staging. They fell for it. But of course, we also saw this. Anyone who didn't share the official narrative during the COVID crisis was very quickly finished. Very quickly, they no longer got a place in public broadcasting discussion forums. I don't know exactly what it's like in other countries. Sometimes I get the feeling that there is more civic courage in France. And perhaps still a few more intellectuals as well, because France has a different intellectual tradition. I mean, Marx said this very sad sentence in his early writings. Germans experience freedom only once, on the day of their funeral. And that applies above all to intellectuals, too.
Und das kann man für die Intellektuellen vor allen Dingen auch sagen. Ne?
Das heißt, die Intellektuellen helfen.
That means intellectuals are helping to bury freedom. Yes, exactly, they are helping. So can we say that anti-democratic thinking does not arise among the intellectually disadvantaged, but in academic circles?
In der akademischen Sphäre.
In der Akademie absolut, würde ich absolut sagen.
Warum?
In academia, absolutely. I would absolutely say so. Why? If you look at our leading intellectuals here, whether it's Mr. Sloterdijk or others, who all started out on the left. I know that I read Sloterdijk's essay on the Weimar Republic with great enthusiasm, where he wrote so brilliantly about how it transitions into fascism and so on. Now, he's a real, not an embedded journalist because he isn't a journalist. He sees himself as a philosopher, but an embedded philosopher. And it's the same with many others. You could name a great many of them. I mean, I find one of them particularly terrible. Well, I'd rather not mention a name.
What makes the German spirit today a sycophant of those in power?
Well, first of all, I think the 1968 movement was possible, and the universities in particular were thrown into such tremendous upheaval. It went so far that we were not only able to help shape the curricula, but through our first student representation, and so on, we also managed back then to have a say in the appointment of professors. That's how it was at one time.
And I believe that deeply frightened those in power at the time. The first steps toward democratization were a threat. They were a threat.
It deeply frightened them, and they vowed this must never happen again. How did they do that? Well, there are studies on the role of the American intelligence services. They pushed strongly American narratives, which had also been developed in America, into Germany, their most important European ally, so that they would become popular here. I think that plays a major role. They did it very skillfully so that the model, the American model, and the American concept of democracy really took hold here, so to speak. But fundamentally, it is pure fiction. In reality, it's an oligarchy hiding behind a democracy, hiding behind a democratic facade. That's how I would describe American society today.
So würde ich die amerikanische Gesellschaft heute bezeichnen. Und die meisten anderen europäischen Gesellschaften, die
And most other European societies are moving in that direction as well. Germany certainly is. But it is remarkable how well it has worked. I think the Bologna process played a major role in that. Universities were really subjected to a reconstruction. You can still see today what remains of that. Universities have become anonymous learning factories. And sociology, for example, which I studied after my basic training in the natural sciences, has become a completely feeble department. Marx, Marcuse, and Adorno are no longer read or taught there. Instead, it is some abstract positivist philosophers. So it has been completely purged. Sociology is now a subject mainly about statistics.
Da geht es Statistik vor allen Dingen.
Also eine verdeckte Säuberung.
Verdeckte Säuberung, so kann man das nennen.
So a covert purge. A covert purge, that's what you could call it. The historian Karl Dietrich Bracher, who died long ago, wrote in his 1969 book, The German Dictatorship, and I quote, "The synchronization of German intellectual life with Hitler's national revolution was appalling, not only in view of the primitiveness of the conglomeration of ideas that fed the Nazi worldview, but even more because of the blind submission to its emphatically intolerant claim to exclusivity. Yet this merely demonstrated the process of self-coordination, extending from constitutional scholars to economists, from historians to Germanists, from philosophers to natural scientists, from publicists to poets, musicians, and visual artists. Byzantinism, manipulation, and coercion became inextricably intertwined. Is that like today?"
Zwang ineinander. Ist das wie heute?
Sehr schön.
It has a great many parallels.
Also damals könnte
Well, you could list them. Carl Schmitt, Heidegger, and so on and so on.
und so weiter und so weiter. Das ist ja eine ganze. Also.
That's a whole. Well, and today, in a certain way, it's like that again. I mean, when you think of our great former liberal philosopher, well, I can't remember the name,
Na, komme nicht auf den Namen. Weil ich mich über den so geärgert habe.
Who do you mean?
Habermas.
Ach so, der
Ja,
kürzlich
Habermas.
verstorbene Jürgen
Habermas. Oh, right, Jürgen Habermas, who recently passed away. Jürgen Habermas, recently deceased. He wrote some very good things back in the era of '68, even though the nasty term left-wing fascists comes from him. But after that, again and again, he made himself the darling of those in power. And this whole philosophy of discourse that he developed, it's thin stuff. There's no real substance in it at all, no idea of resistance. And to me, that's typical. He's regarded as the German post-war philosopher, Habermas.
Der deutsche Nachkriegsphilosoph Habermas.
Inzwischen haben wir
By now, we have a generation that doesn't even know what to make of that name. Are we living in an age of idiocy?
Zeit der Idiotie.
Also ich denke, das hatte Erich Fromm mal gesagt.
Well, I think Erich Fromm once said this, and I have a great deal of respect for him. He saw the beginning of the computer age coming, and he was very alert to what it meant. Erich Fromm said, "I foresee a time when professors will gradually be replaced by computer programs. Today, we would say by AI, by robotics, and AI. And he said, I see this time coming. If it really takes hold, if it is no longer people teaching students and engaging with them, but abstract programs. Today, we would call them AI programs. Then a culture thousands of years old will come to an end. Lately, whenever I see the progress AI has made, and how even my grandchildren are already using AI to fiddle with their texts, I keep thinking of Erich Fromm's warning, that we are now on a path that can truly send shivers down your spine.
Der einem wirklich das Gruseln lehren kann.
A new age of illiteracy is emerging here.
Ja, denke ich schon. Das kann man daran sehen.
Yes, I think so. You can see it in that. I noticed it when I was teaching at the Baden-Württemberg Film Academy. Their knowledge of literature was incredibly thin. They barely knew their Brecht anymore. They still knew a few classics, but they no longer really knew the classics of modernism at all. In film, they knew, so to speak, only the latest from Hollywood, but the classics of classic cinema too, starting with Lubitsch and going all the way to, well, what's his name? The great one. I can't think of the name. Unfortunately, my memory for names is...
Lubitsch, Curtis, exactly. Fassbinder, Wim Wenders.
Fassbinder was already no longer in. That's when I realized that entire eras of cultural history, in this case film history, are gone. People aren't interested in them anymore, and they're hardly taught anymore either. So there's an incredible, I think we're heading toward a time that has no history.
Historical amnesia. Historical amnesia, yes. The spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, said the Russians have forgiven, the Germans have forgotten. Would you agree with that? Yes, very much so.
Ja, sehr gut, ja. Die Deutschen haben vergessen.
The Germans have forgotten, and the Russians still have a rich culture that they value. I see that in Germany. We also have a rich culture, which incidentally is greatly appreciated by Russians. It has always surprised me that after all the horrors we inflicted on the Russians, they still have such high regard for German culture. At the same time, German culture has its own horrors and blind spots, and perhaps it even contributed, unconsciously, to the atrocities of German politics.
Is the civilizational regression you describe part of the decline of the West? You could put it that way, yes.
Ja, das kann man wirklich so sagen.
You really can put it that way. Digitalization alone is an enormous process. It's not just that digitalization is creating a huge complex of surveillance industries, driven forward by the EU, as well as by Silicon Valley. I think we are actually dealing with a civilizational turning point and a crisis. That's what I would call it. Because you get the sense that the entire legacy of the Enlightenment, within which we on the left have seen ourselves, and within which Marxism has situated itself.
In dem sich der Marxismus verortet. Ich habe mich immer in meinen...
I have always seen myself, in both my literary and scholarly writings, as part of the tradition of the Enlightenment. I studied Marxism quite closely. My first work was an attempt to shed light on psychoanalysis and Marxism through each other. Neurosis, Class Struggle. It was actually a worldwide bestseller. Back then I was translated into dozens of languages. Of course, all forgotten now. So I have always seen myself in the tradition of the Enlightenment, and I still do today. But increasingly one feels alone in that.
Man fühlt sich da zunehmend allein.
Is reason's claim to universality, which emerges from the Enlightenment, being replaced by an identity-based way of thinking that appeals to the supposedly superior validity of one's own social group? I would agree with that. Who is the social bearer of this identity-based thinking?
Wer ist der soziale Träger dieses identitären Denkens?
Of this identity-based way of thinking? Well, there are certain social groups that carry it. They are, of course, the groups that have taken over certain areas in culture and in politics as well. Can this be directly pinned down through class analysis? I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet. But it's an interesting question.
Perhaps academics in precarious employment.
Well, that's a point I've reflected on several times myself. The precariat, the academic precariat, I think, plays an incredibly important role in the processes we've just described. I addressed this in a particular essay where I described this turn among intellectuals, and ultimately, I traced it back to the role of the intellectual precariat, who can now only survive both inside and outside the university if they anchor themselves in this area, rather than, say, in Enlightenment-oriented and possibly anti-capitalist issues. Identity is, of course, a big, beautiful, broad field where you can talk a lot of nonsense and where you can also reach certain groups. That is probably more correct.
Wo man auch eben bestimmte Gruppen erreicht. Das ist bestimmt richtig, ja.
Dazu sagt der Historiker Götz Ali.
Historian Götz Ali says, National Socialism too was an identity-based movement. That's true, yes. Does the fragmentation of thinking today have anything to do with neoliberalism and neoliberal employment conditions?
Neoliberalen Beschäftigungsverhältnis?
Ja, auf jeden Fall. Also ich meine, das akademische
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the academic precariat is a consequence of a neoliberal economic model that has, of course, also taken hold of universities, and not just universities. It certainly has to do with the main illness of today's economic system, neoliberalism. It has also led to almost the entire body of anti-capitalist thought, along with the literature that goes with it, more or less quietly disappearing, fading away, and now really only being found in individual groups or outside the mainstream.
Abseits des Mainstreams sich überhaupt noch findet. Also ich merke, ich bin da noch mit
Well, I came of age with Rudi Dutschke. We were still friends, especially after the assassination attempt. At that time, of course, the issues that concerned us all had to do with analyzing capital and with the utopian idea that we could somehow not only make this capitalism more humane, but overcome it. Today, that kind of thinking is completely gone. It's completely gone. And in that sense, it really is astonishing how that was achieved. It has to do with identity-based thinking. And of course, it also has to do with the precariat.
Mit dem Prekariat hat es auch zu tun, selbstverständlich. Aber es hat sozusagen auch zu tun mit.
But it also has to do with, although this is no longer quite as true today, with the triumph of neoliberalism over many years in the 90s and the 2000s, and with American cultural theories which also flooded the universities. Identity-based thinking plays a very major role in that. Yes, but what is striking is that unfortunately, it has happened this way almost everywhere in Europe. Even France, which has a different history from ours, a happier history than Germany. When I look at the cultural scene in Paris, the new philosophers have been successful there for decades and have set the tone. I see very few new forces.
Neue Kräfte, neue wirklich.
Weil andere wie Emanuel Todd gar nicht in die Zeitung.
Because others like Emmanuel Todd don't make it into the newspapers at all. Of course, Emmanuel Todd, sure, he's one of them. But I have a great deal of respect for him, of course. In all societies, Mr. Schneider, that have been plowed over by neoliberalism, there is enormous anger. Because of social spending cuts, because responsibility has been shifted from the welfare state level onto individuals, because working conditions and employment contracts have deteriorated. If this anger remains bottled up in everyday life, it can still be redirected toward other ethnic groups, minorities, or outward toward other nations. Is it possible here to create a displacement of aggression that can then be used politically?
Die politisch genutzt wird.
Naja, ich fürchte, dass das natürlich passieren.
Well, I'm afraid that can of course happen if the AfD becomes even stronger. Although, I don't preach the image of the AfD as the enemy. I think this whole campaign by the red-green-red parties against the AfD, those are precisely the warmongers, the Greens and the left, and by now also the Social Democrats and the neoliberals. So these parties make it very easy for themselves by defining the AfD, so to speak, as right-leaning, right-affiliated, potentially fascistoid, an identitarian party, and so on. But after all, the AfD does have a different relationship with Russia than, say, the Green parties do. They're still not directly pro-Russia, but they don't go along with this very strict Russophobic course. And they also do so in the German Bundestag's Commission of Inquiry into the handling of COVID.
Kommission des Deutschen Bundestages in der Corona-Aufarbeitung. Da spielte die AfD keine schlechte Rolle. Aber natürlich.
The AfD is not playing a bad role in this. But of course, if we know history, and it can repeat itself, just under different circumstances, the AfD could also be brought into line very quickly. The ruling factions of capital are very, very fast and very, very skillful at that, especially when ministerial posts are being offered. Excuse me? When ministerial posts are being offered, they can very quickly be steered into the appropriate waters. So that is certainly something to fear. And at the moment, I I don't know. This will certainly take a number of years. It won't happen overnight, I think, especially since this party is very strongly rooted in Eastern Germany, and the East does not have the same Russophobia as Western society, in my view.
Wie die Westgesellschaft, finde ich. Weil die haben natürlich die DDR-Bürger haben die Russen ja doch auch.
Because, of course, East German citizens experience the Russians as people too. They experience them naturally as occupying soldiers who were usually confined to their barracks. But they also had quite a lot of contact with Russians. There were many cultural events involving Russians. They also saw that Russians were often very poor, that they came from poor regions of the Soviet Union, and so on, that they were not the evil enemy. I think that distinguishes the East somewhat from the West. So yes, I do have the hope that things will not turn out quite the way Western politicians here would like them to.
Diese Hoffnung habe ich schon.
Is
the firewall the life insurance policy of the parties pushing for war?
Diese Brandmauer, ja.
This firewall, yes, there's a good publicist I think highly of named Ivan Schultz, who also writes for Freitag from time to time. He analyzed it exactly the way you just put it. It's a kind of situation where, if this firewall falls, and it's being maintained by every possible means, if this Beelzebub, so to speak, can no longer be managed politically, then things will get difficult. Then those green-yellow, though the yellow ones play no role at all, red parties will have to admit that they themselves are infected by what they constantly accuse the AfD of being. That will be an interesting confrontation, because I don't think this firewall will hold much longer. I really don't.
Because the balance of power is changing. Is the ruling party cartel seeking salvation in revenge for Stalingrad?
für Stalingrad.
Well, I wouldn't want to go back that far in history. I'm thinking more in political economic terms. This American model, which is still dominant, so to speak, even for the West. Oligarchies that still disguise themselves as democracies, but that are actually on the verge of implosion. An implosion of their entire financial system and their entire economic model. That is why they are becoming so aggressive toward their own vassals, toward their own allies. We should talk more about that point, because perhaps that is where some hope is grounded. This model can, I think all these wars of aggression that Trump is now starting, whether it's the war against Venezuela, or in this case, the imprisonment and kidnapping of Maduro. And of course, they immediately lay their hands on the oil, then the war against Iran. The fact that, aside from Russia, the two most important oil-producing countries in the world are now becoming targets of American wars, that points me in a different direction. It suggests to me that American financial capitalism, with these incredible financial bubbles and this enormous debt that can never be repaid, is trying by every means, so to speak, to prop up this crumbling system again with real assets.
And of course, that is an initial goal.
That's how I explain it, so to speak. I don't think Americans care about Stalingrad. They don't have any trauma around it either. They weren't there. They helped finance Hitler's war, but that was a long time ago. Their own survival is at stake. Their system itself is standing on feet of clay. It's a wavering colossus we're dealing with. That's why it is so aggressive toward its vassal states and shows no consideration for them. The best example was that they blew up a lifeline right out from under us, Nord Stream. And that led to what we all know the consequences are. We become dependent on America's LNG gas, which costs 4 times as much. That is how we are being deindustrialized. Many industries simply can no longer compete with those high energy costs. So, an empire that treats its vassals that way only shows how deeply it's in the shit itself. And my hope is that there is, after all, a movement away from this in Germany as well, among some European politicians. They were deeply shocked that Trump and Putin were, so to speak, negotiating directly behind their backs, without the slightest regard for Europe. You described it well in your article, the one in Overton, I believe. Germany is really only something like actually, what did you call it? In the New World Order now taking shape, Europe is only a cup of Asia. A cup of Asia. That's how I described it.
Das Kap Asiens, so haben Sie es beschrieben. Genau.
Der Schriftsteller Michael Schneider sagt,
Exactly. The writer Michael Schneider says, all wars are resource wars. Wavering financial capital needs new securities in order to keep developing. Thank you very much for that. Here at Against the Current, we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about.
welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.